All right, give me 1 second to get this. So yeah, I know it's, we're talking about a game, but I had to make a PowerPoint in order to explain this kind of stuff just because, yeah, I don't have any idea how to do it otherwise. So sorry you came for a PowerPoint lecture, but I will try to make it fun and cool. So I'm going to be telling you guys, like I said, a very deep kind of overview of the genetic system in the game and how Legacy is different from a lot of other horse breeding sims out there. So let's get started. First thing, though, I want to say is, for people who might be listening in who haven't already been a part of the game, Legacy is available to play as a limited alpha right now. So if you join our Discord, we periodically have a sign up available for people to join in waves of being testers. So if you're interested, please join us at Discord and sign up next time we have it. We also are planning to move to a more open type alpha, maybe by the end of the year. We're not exactly sure on the dates when, but in that case, it will be, you don't have to come through Discord to sign up. It will just be, you go to the website and are able to sign up there. And we're hoping that by sometime next year, everything will be smoothened out and we will be ready for full release in 2024. So, like we've said before, Legacy is a horse breeding and stable management sim game. There's lots of games out there like this, but so how is Legacy different? Like, I have to kind of go back to how Legacy started to really tell you guys why we created it. So Whitney and I met, it's been over a decade now, I think, back playing another horse sim game that has since gone under. And when that game went under, we felt a void. There was no other game out there just right for us. We ran into issues like the games just had no or oversimplified genetics beyond color of the horses, or the horses in the game were just unrealistic super horses, like super strong, super fast, and everything that a horse could do all in one horse, which just isn't very realistic. Or situations where the player bred horses were very similar to the game generated horses. So breeding just didn't really have a point to it. So we got bored very quickly. So we wanted to make a game together. So Whitney and I since then have both accumulated multiple degrees. So Whitney went into school for graphic design and software development, and I went to school for animal science and genetics. And Whitney proposed this idea to me in 2019 that we could make a game in our spare time. And here we are 4 years later. But our goal with Legacy is to be a more sandbox-like genetics game. So I'm going to explain to you a bit what we mean by sandbox here. So with modern day horses, they have gone through many, many hundreds of years, thousands of years of selective breeding in order to become what they are today versus a wild horse. And I should say too, guys, the chat is up. I can see it. I'm not the greatest. I'm not normally a streamer. So Whitney's going to be helping me if you guys have questions, but feel free to toss questions in the chat. Whitney's also going to try to keep me grounded if I go too far sciencey on this. But yeah, feel free to ask me questions if you don't understand anything. But yeah, so through thousands of years of selective breeding, we have very specialized horses such as the thoroughbred or warm bloods or big draft horses. And a lot of horse sim games, when you import breeds on them, the breeds are already very specialized. So in terms of genetics, that just means they're very refined already. So you start here, if you imagine this is as high as you can go, so you're already very close to the ceiling. Whereas Legacy, we actually start you back here to where your horses are only as slightly refined. And I'll tell you a bit about what I mean by slightly refined in a bit. But kind of a different way of looking at this, we give you these starter horses that have pretty average stats. They're usually around the middle. And yes, we do allow any color in any breed. I'll explain more a bit about why we did that anyway, or later in the stream. But our horses have, a lot of things that you can breed for. We have these performance abilities. We have conformation. You could breed for showing, in hand, or disciplines, or color, whatever you want. There's a whole lot of things you could do. But kind of the big picture thing behind this is we give you these import horses that don't have much genetic refinement. You can kind of think of them like a lump of clay in our game. And your goal as the player is to breed them and refine them and shape them in any way you want, with some limitations, to become champion horses based on whatever you choose. So keeping that in mind, let's dive deep into the genetics of the game. Because this is going to be, I promise you, a lot deeper than you will find in any genetics game currently out there, largely just because the chances that they have somebody with a PhD designing it is near zero, and chances that you have somebody, you know, like who's a PhD and also loves horses and designing games is just the odds of it. No.
In other words, I hit the lottery.
Yeah, this friendship was perfect for making a genetics game. So. All right. So in terms of genetics, we've told you guys about this before. Just want to rehash it a bit. The horses in the game have over 600 genes. Those get broken up into affecting many different things. Most of them affect conformation, which we have over 30 conformation traits. So that's why it's so many. But you can breed for things like performance abilities, personalities, coat color. There's diseases you can breed away from, fertility, and so much more in the game. But what exactly, how exactly do the genetics function, and what can we expect? Well, you guys have probably all seen Punnett squares, hopefully. So a lot of games have this already, where you have a system where, you have complete dominance showing where the B allele is dominant, produces this blue phenotype, to the R allele, which produces a yellow phenotype. Or you'll have something where it's like an incomplete dominance scenario where the B allele and R allele are not completely, the B allele is not completely dominant to R, so you get a in-between phenotype with the heterozygotes. So Legacy has things like that. An example for this would be something like the coat color gene cream. Something like this would be an example of the coat color extension. A lot of games have that. So what? But Legacy goes far beyond. We also have examples of pleiotropy in the game, which pleiotropy is one gene affecting more than one trait. So this adds to the complexity of breeding for certain traits. For example, KIT, which, if you don't know, KIT is typically thought of as a coat color gene. It makes Sabinos and dominant white, but it affects both coat color and stallion fertility in the game. So KIT is known to, in real life, affect sperm production. Actually, mutations in it, which produce the pretty coat colors, actually reduce sperm production, so stallion fertility is decreased with it. There's a height gene in the game that also increases leg length. It's based off of IGF-1 in real life, if you're a nerd and you want to check this out. But I'm not going to go too deep into that. Anyway, there's also a body bulk gene, which is kind of similar in that if instead of like a horse growing up, it actually more affects how the horse grows out and it accumulates bulk in muscle and bone. We also have a lot of situations where one conformation trait can affect more than one ability. Such as an example of a flatter hip will increase stride, but it will decrease the strength of the horse. And lighter muscle mass is good for stamina, but bad for strength, things like that. It's just kind of, a lot of these are common sense, function follows form based on real life, which is a thing we're really proud of, that the game has a lot. I don't think any other game out there has this deep of conformation affecting performance ability like real life. That is to say, though, in doing this, we had to be very careful about balancing how things are affected. And we personally don't like it when you have an unrealistic super horse that's just amazing at everything. Because in real life, there's trade-offs between everything you breed for. So the game also does simulate this. And I want to say that perfect stats across everything in Legacy is impossible, which, yeah, sounds harsh, maybe not, but I think it's pretty cool that we were able to do this. We also have examples of linkage and recombination in the game. So linkage and recombination just means that not all genes are inherited independently. This is because in real life, the genes are all situated on chromosomes, which are like a long strand of DNA that is all physically linked. And only through recombination can those genes that are on the same chromosome be actually switched up in what alleles are inherited. So this just affects how frequently certain alleles are inherited together, such as Roan and Tobiano are linked in the game, Kitten Extension are linked in the game, and as well as others. So it just adds to the complexity of things. We've also got sexual dimorphism in the game. So in real life, we know this. Mares and stallions are slightly different. Stallions tend to be stronger than mares, and their reproductive systems are different. So in the game, what I've done is we've got 34 fertility genes in the game. 10 don't affect mares, 10 don't affect stallions. 2 genes affect both differently. So it just really adds to the complexity of trying to breed for better fertility if you're interested in that. There's also epistasis in the game where one gene outcome affects another. For example, in the game, like these are not testable genes, but in intelligence, there's one gene that must be completely recessive in order for gene 4 to be expressed. So if gene 3, if you have a dominant allele, gene 4 does nothing. We've also got a lot of examples of hybrid vigor, or also known as heterosis, where the heterozygous horse outperforms the homozygous horse. So I'm going to stop there for a second just to jump into a special spreadsheet I've made to show you guys an actual deep look into one specific formula for balance in the game, to show you how these stats are calculated in the horses and how different genes affect them. So let's go dive to that real quick. Give me 1 second to pull it over here. All right. So balance in the game is 80% conformation, 20% genes. In total, there's 98 genes that affect it. Obviously, 98 genes is a ton of information to show you guys, so I just broke it down to only show you 10 that show like a wide breadth of like what we have in the game, and then I set the other genes, which you can't see here. But so what we've got here is these are the genes I wanted to show you. These are their specific alleles. This is the value of those specific allele combinations for balance. So these get added up in addition to the conformation traits over here. All of these except height affect balance. I've got height here. I'll show you for another reason. So height does not affect balance. That's why there's no value. But these are the conformation traits, their values. But then this is how that specific conformation trait gets added up to create this balance score down here. So this is the actual formula in the game. And I want to say, guys, these math formulas are incredibly complicated. And I know a lot of you have tried figuring out how exactly these are made. Honestly, you're going to give yourself a massive headache. This game is created so that a person with a PhD in genetics, can play it without having a significant advantage over any of you. It's incredibly complex. Like I know the formulas. I made the formulas. I don't want to think about the formulas or look at them. They take minutes, like probably 10 plus minutes for me to enter all the information and to even just calculate one horse manually. These are, it's insane. And I don't recommend like hitting your head against the wall trying to figure these things out. Just look at what the information you're given and breed for better horses. Like that's all you need to know. But let's do a little bit of a look here of what we are really playing with in the game. So these 10 genes over here, we have 4 main situations going on. So this section up here is specifically for leg proportion, which is highlighted here in orange. And these are 5 genes that are just balance specific. So these genes 1 through 4 here in leg proportion, for example, they just have a simple additive effect on balance. So if I change this to 5, it has a 5 value to balance. So you'll see balance go up down here. So it's not necessarily though a direct value. Like, so this value here, I should say, sorry, is for leg proportion. So you're seeing leg proportion change and then balance change as a result of it. These down here actually get added to the balance score. So it's a complex multi-step system that we've got going on here. These ones though are fairly simple. It's just an additive effect. Whereas up here, this height gene, this is actually an example of pleiotropy. So this gene is that IGF-1 mimic that I told you about. So this affects both leg length and height in the horse. So we've got 3 alleles here of different values that you can imagine. The higher number is meant to increase height more. So we've got a tall horse right now. You can watch, I think actually I broke this, and the height normally should increase, and I'm sorry, I forgot to fix this. But the height should increase as we change this, and I think, yeah, I broke it. Dang it, I forgot to fix that. I'm sorry. But normally when you change these alleles here on this gene, you'll change the leg proportion and change the height as well. So a horse with longer legs is more likely to be taller, is the basis of it. But yeah, I'm not sure how exactly I broke it. But anyway, down here, we've got genes 3 and 4 in balance, which are epistatic to each other. So basically what happens is if gene 3 is recessive, gene 4 has no effect. So you can see here, when I change this to recessive, we lost that value. If I change it back to having a dominant allele, it doesn't matter if it's double dominant or single, but then gene 4 can have an effect, but it's even more complicated than that. Gene 4 just can have no effect by itself. So it's a complicated relationship between these two. And then this one here, we've got a 1 and 0 allele, and you see currently we've got a double 0 horse. Their value is 4. If we change it to a heterozygote, their value is now 6. We change it to a double dominant, their value is now 2. So that is an example of heterosis where the heterozygous horse had the highest value. But as you can see over here, it's just incredibly complicated on how these things end up all playing together to create this balanced score down here. So yeah, that is a deep sneak peek at the actual calculations in the game. I'm not going to tell you anything more than that. Honestly, guys, you don't want to know anything more than that unless you're like me and love math, which I don't think there's not many people out there like that. So don't hurt yourself trying to think about these things too much. Just go for, higher numbers are better, and breeding higher number horses together is good. Let's jump back to my PowerPoint though. And of course, presenter view Y. 1 second. Okay. So how do you breed for better horses in the game when you have something this complex? Well, my biggest advice to you is going to be pick a goal, stick with that goal, and go for it. So I'm going to give you an example here of, we're going to try to breed some horses for better jumping. So if you can imagine, I started the game, I imported 5 horses, and this is them here. So they all have a range in jumping abilities. Let me get my laser pointer back. Sorry about that. So they all vary quite a bit in their jumping ability. Some of them better than others. So this one here is really good. If you, for those of you who've never played the game yet, the blue over here is the highest you can get. So higher max over here is a better horse. So I have these horses, and I decide that this one over here has too poor of jumping to be a breeder. So I end up selling or rehoming and keeping just the 4 horses. And let's say there are 2 mares and 2 stallions. I decide to breed them, and hopefully these horses will, produce good foals, and then I will start a herd. And over time, through the generations, I will see an increase in the mean jumping ability. So the average jumping ability of my herd over time. That's the general goal of the game, usually, unless you're breeding for color, in which case you just, decide how your horse looks, if you like it or not. So how do the genetics actually work though? Like what can you expect when breeding horses? Let's look at things in a broad sense. Are foals an average? So we've gotten this question a lot. So if you bred, say, a stud who has a 40 jumping ability with a dam who has a 60 jumping ability, does that mean your offspring are going to be 50? The answer to that is maybe. And thinking a different way before I get too deep into this is, how do you get better horses in the game? If you take your best horses, a stud who has 60, a dam who has 60, does that mean the game is going to give you a better jumping offspring because you bred 2 similar horses together? The answer is every time, definitely not. But to answer honestly to both of these is, it depends on each horse's specific genetics. So what do I mean by that? Let's take a look at things. So let's imagine we have a monogenetic trait, so a trait that is affected by just one gene. Let's play and imagine that this square here represents one gene. These halves of the box are the 2 different alleles the horse has. The red color indicates it's a bad allele for whatever our purpose is. White indicates it's a medium, like kind of neutral allele. And then a blue, which I don't have shown here, is a good allele, the allele we want. So these here will represent a single horse with 5 genes. And as you can see, they have a mix of blue, they have a mix of white, and they have a mix of red. Imagine these are my starting horses. So there's some good in here, some bad in here. So over time, the purpose is you want to select the best for breeding, which you won't be able to see the genes usually in the game. You just kind of have to go off of, the conformation scores and the performance abilities and things that we tell you. But if we were looking at the actual genes, we'd want to pick the best ones based on their genes. And then after many generations, we're hoping that we're going to end up with horses that have only the best alleles. So essentially, kind of in a broad sense, our goal is to reduce genetic diversity so that we have very refined horses that are kind of genetically limited just to be very good. But it's not that easy in the game. So legacy horses, like I said, have over 600 genes, and we only have 17 testable genes, and most of those are just color. So if you're breeding for performance and things, this is going to be a very complicated game. I mean, in real life, horses have thousands, if not tens of thousands of genes. Just trying to breed for anything is an incredibly complex process. So how do we accomplish our goals in real life and in the game? Well, we typically do that through something that's just simply called selection. And this may be kind of obvious, but if you imagine we have a herd of horses and you plot them on a chart here with the x-axis indicating the horse's jumping ability. So the best ones are plotted over here, the worst ones are over here. And then the y-axis is your number of horses that fit that category. So the majority of your horses all end up being somewhere in the middle. And you look at these horses and you're trying to figure out, what exactly does this mean in terms of genetics? Well, horses on the left side of the graph will end up being the ones who most likely have more alleles that you don't want. And the ones on the right side end up having more alleles that you do want. So in selection, what you do is you decide somewhere to make a cutoff. And only horses on a certain level or above are going to become breeders. And in doing that, you should limit down the number of bad alleles that are in your herd and hopefully increase the good alleles and end up improving your jumping ability or whatever you want over time. So how effective is doing this? I wanted to give you guys a good example. So I went over to our testing server, kind of turned off reality for a little bit so that I could massively breed up a bunch of horses really fast. And I created some little bits of data to show you guys. So I started with 50 nab strip horses and selected those with the top 13 jumping ability to become breeders. So I selected only the top 26% of my horses. And I went crazy and bred all these mares and stallions at least 10 times, oftentimes the same repeating breeding over and over and over, generating a total of 100 foals. And then I plotted their jumping ability on a graph like I just showed you. And this is the result. So this is jumping ability down here, and then this is the number of foals that fell into that category. So as you can see here, it turns out pretty similar to kind of like what I expect. The majority of horses all fall somewhere in the center, with few being really good and a few being on the poor end of things. And there's another way we could look at this too here. This chart just showing the distribution of the foals. The foals are in blue, the parents were in red. So you can see there's a massive amount of distribution and variation from breeding these 13 horses. Why so much variation? Well, it's because the game uses these complex polygenic traits. So jumping ability alone is affected by 102 genes. And as you can imagine, just one generation of breeding, trying to control 102 genes is really hard. Obviously, I'm not going to get down to all the blue alleles all at once. So it's difficult. You end up with a lot of variation, but it's kind of a fun, cool thing because this is kind of what happens in real life and breeding for like traits in dairy cattle or sheep or whatever. So I went a little further with those horses and kept picking the top 15 breeders from the 100 foals and creating another generation. And what I saw was a similar thing over time, that the majority of the foals fall somewhere in the middle, but my maximum jumping score has increased with every generation, thankfully. So it looks like my breeding scheme was working. And I will say, I quickly bred these guys. I only selected the breeders based on their jumping score. I did not look at their conformation at all. I did not look at their talents, anything. So these guys were bred only just based on jumping ability. And looking at it as plotting the means of their jumping ability, starting with the generation 0 as being the foundation horses, and generation 3 is where I stopped. I did see over time that my mean score did increase. So this just shows that picking something in the game and selecting specifically for that one thing does usually work, as long as you're careful and you pay attention to that one trait. But some of you might be curious, what happened to the other performance abilities when I did this? Because I didn't pay attention to them at all when breeding these horses. And the cool thing about the game is just because you breed for one specific trait, which is very isolated, doesn't mean that you're going to get better in anything else. And honestly, anything else that did improve here, which intelligence, I ended up getting a higher trait over time. Stamina, I ended up getting higher over time. This was just pure luck, because I did not pay attention to them at all. But as you can see, most things pretty much stayed the exact same in the horses. And that's due to the fact that their genetics are highly complicated. But don't be too worried about this. I know you guys probably have come from other games, which typically when you increase one stat, other stats increase. So as you play the game more and more and more, you get better and better and better. The game is intended to work like this and be a little more difficult. This is based on real life. So if you imagine a thoroughbred in real life, they're not going to be super horses in, say, balance, agility, and jumping speed, stamina, strength, everything. They're not going to be. If I made a thoroughbred in the game based on like a real life thoroughbred, they'd probably look something like this, where speed is their main stat, and they're good at some other things, but not so good at strength at all. That's totally normal in the game. You do not need to max out every stat. A lot of the disciplines don't even, are not even affected by several of the stats. So this is normal for the game. And you imagine, for example, a draft horse would be something different, where they would excel in strength, but be terrible jumpers. So this is kind of what you can expect in the game. I did want to kind of point out a couple things, though. This was an example of just selection in the game does work really well. But there are a couple things to think about when doing this. And I'll just give them a brief overview here before I step into a deeper look at what I mean. So when I bred these horses, a lot of the foals, no matter the generation, were in between the parents as far as jumping ability, and some were worse. Why would that be? I'll give you the answer to that in just a minute. I also want to point out that selection and selection intensity do have a downside. So this game is based purely on genetics. It's not just like a random number generator that the longer you play, the better you get, just because the game is rewarding you for playing. So there are some things you have to be aware of and be careful about, and I'll tell you about those in a second. And this kind of plays into that in a closed system. So if you imagine a closed system, that you have a ranch of horses that you only breed with your own horses and never buy other horses, never use outside studs. There's no guarantee that with each generation that you breed that you will be better than the next. And I'll tell you why in just a second. But let's look at that first note, which was that a lot of foals, no matter the generation, were born in between the parents, and some were worse. So this is my histogram I showed you of the distribution of the foals. So why would this be? Well, it boils down to the fact that there's a lot of genes, which means there's a lot of potential combinations of alleles in the game. So just the way it works when you have a lot of genes and a lot of possibilities is just through, random inheritance of them. The genetics are more likely to kind of cancel each other out and pull everything back to some medium, middle, and in between something, whatever your maximum and your minimum is for that. So you end up getting a lot more horses distributing in some middle. So this is normal. This is realistic. This is what happens in real life, and this is what the game is designed to do. So you will see this a lot. Like if you were able to breed a mare and one stallion together multiple times in the game, and then plotted their offspring on a graph like this, you would see something like this. This is how the game is supposed to function. And I want to give an example of this with one specific trait. So if we look at hip angle, hip angle in the game is controlled by 8 genes. There's 20 outcomes. So 20 outcomes, I mean like the actual number value you guys have seen in the confirmation tabs, that you can have like a 50 hip angle, 55, 60, 65. They're always in increments of 5 between 0 and 100. So that comes out to 20 outcomes. So there's only 20 outcomes, 8 genes, but there's actually 26,000 possible genotypes in the game, which is a lot. And if I plot these, another histogram here. So if you look at, these are the hip angles, that possible outcomes that you can have. And this is the count. This is the number of genotypes that produce that outcome. There's almost 4,000 genotypes that produce the 50. So like I said, it's just so many genes coming all together. There's so many different alleles, and just by like the fact that they can kind of cancel, some of them can cancel each other out, things end up kind of coming together towards the middle more often. So this is just one confirmation trait though. The performance abilities, it's kind of the same deal, but they are obviously much more complex because there's much more genes. So yeah. So why did we make it like this? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is it's just realistic, but why, I guess, are the horses in the middle a lot? So the foundation horses we give you, like I said, there's 600 genes. They're mostly randomized, and I'm saying mostly now. I will tell you a bit what I mean by that later. Their stats are around 50. So just as I showed you, that probably means that if you had a whole herd of imports and they're all around 50, even though they have stats that are very similar, that probably means they have a lot of genetic diversity across the horses. So just because they're 50s, one horse's genotype could potentially be very different from the other. Just because in this area, this is where you have the most diversity, the most potential combinations of genotypes that produce this. Whereas over here, there's very few genotypes that produce an amazing horse and very few that produce a very terrible horse. So the fact that there's a lot of diversity gives you a lot of potential good and bad alleles to work with. So this gives you a lot to play with in the game, gives you room to really carve out your horses, so that the game doesn't end too quickly, that you just beat it really fast. And through this, hopefully, you should be able to create some really unique lines of horses. You could breed, somebody could take an Arabian and breed for agility, and somebody else could take an Arabian and breed for stamina. And the two lines are very, very unique. So it should hopefully give you guys a good sense of satisfaction once you've really had time to play and generate your herds. I will say, though, it is important in this game, just because it's so complex, that you pick a small number of goals and be very selective. If you waffle around and don't really know what you're breeding for and just throw random horses together, there's a good chance you're just going to stick around this diverse middle a lot, which there's nothing wrong with necessarily if that's your goal, if you want to just breed for color. But if you're wanting to breed for disciplines, you do need to hone in and focus and be selective. That's how horses like the thoroughbred were generated in real life today. So my second note was that selection and selection intensity do have a downside. What I mean by that is, so if you imagine, like I showed you this histogram kind of earlier, that we picked horses between some line to become breeders. You pick where that line is. Like you could pick this being the cutoff point here, and this is less intense than a cutoff point over here. Doing that, though, you're obviously kicking out a bunch of horses for becoming breeders, and this can be a problem. So if you imagine this example I showed you earlier, say we selected only our best horses for breeding. We don't know their genetics at all. We just know that they perform best in whatever stat. We want to reduce genetic diversity over time to get just the best alleles, but maybe we have something like this happen where we didn't actually end up with all blue alleles. So why is that? Well, if we hone in and look in on just those founder horses we selected, we actually lost the blue allele at this one gene. So this blue allele does not exist in our herd. There's no way it's going to just suddenly happen. So we couldn't actually end up with the best case scenario horses. Which leads me into my third note, was that in a closed system, if you don't breed with outside horses or buy any other horses, and you just play by yourself, you could very easily end up losing good alleles in your herd. So that will end up looking like at some point over the generations of breeding, your stats are going to stagnate. And you're going to need to bring in new blood. And this happens because those alleles either just never existed in your herd. Maybe you just never got lucky and your foundation horses never had the allele you want. Or just like this scenario here, you happen to select breeders that didn't have it. So all this is to say, legacy is extremely complex. I hope I've shown that. Now I hope I haven't made you guys feel like it's impossible. I promise you it's not. It's an incredibly difficult, but also incredibly rewarding game that is based on real life as much as we possibly could make it. It will be tough. Do expect it to be tough, and it'll take a long time, many generations to get what you want. But like I said, you should be able to create these very unique and hopefully satisfactory, distinct legacies in the game. So going forward too, I just want to really quickly touch on too, what if you want to breed for multiple traits? It's kind of the same thing in the game. Just you have to pick your best breeders and select them. But in real life, there's two different ways that people will do this, and this will work for the game as well. You could do what's called tandem selection or use independent culling values. So what tandem selection is you just pick one trait, focus solely on it, get it to what you want, and then do the other. In theory, this is a faster way to select for that one trait. The cons you got to watch out for is just because you focus on that one trait, if you let the other trait just go, you might lose the good alleles and your horses end up not being as good as they could have been. Whereas independent culling values is where you set a cutoff for horses have to be so good in one trait and another trait in order to become breeders. So you breed for two traits at the same time. The con with this is the horse with the best genetics for one trait might be lost if they fall below the cull line for the other trait. So these are just some examples of kind of big picture things that people do in real life to, say, breed for a dairy cow who produces the most milk and also has the best fertility, something like that. These are just some things for you guys to think about in the game. But let's also talk about inbreeding, because I know people have asked me about this many times about, is it allowed in the game? Is it bad? And what can you expect? So inbreeding, for those of you who don't know, is the mating of two closely related individuals. And I've got it kind of shown here. So this is a pedigree chart showing this stallion here who carries a yellow allele. He's heterozygous for it, is bred to two different mares. They produce foals who are half siblings, and then you breed those half siblings together to create some horses. So no, inbreeding is not bad. It is not blanket bad. It is allowed in the game. It is a complex process or a complex tool that you can use. Why would people do it? Well, in short, it's done to increase homozygosity. Which, as I talked to you guys just about earlier, a lot of the goals of selective breeding is to reduce genetic diversity in your herd to only the alleles you're interested in. Inbreeding is a very fast way to do that. It can be bad. It can be good. So let's talk about that a little bit here. So I also went over to our testing server and generated some inbred horses just to show you what would happen to them in the game. So I started with one stallion and 5 mares, bred him to those 5 mares a couple times, selected the best foals from them, and bred F1s, which, sorry, I don't know if people are aware of that nomenclature, but that's just typically what the first generation is called in science. Those F1s are not inbred, but then I took them, they're all half siblings, and bred them together. So I've created a first inbred generation of F2s, took those foals, inbred them again, and inbred them again until I was out to F4s. And this is an example pedigree of what I created. So here is the foundation in their pedigree. These are the foundation horses. So this was I used these colored stars to show you guys which horses were used repeatedly. So this yellow star is the stud, and he was the only foundation stud used. So he's in this pedigree a lot. And this particular horse ended up, I think, only getting 4 of the 5 brood mares in. So there's a red star. Okay, actually, I think it's 3 of the brood mares. Green, blue, and red mares were used. So this horse was very inbred. And actually, the dam and sire of it were full siblings, which you can see here. So very, very inbred. I don't know that you necessarily want to do this in the game, but I did it for you, and I'll show you what happened. So let's look at this chart here. I bred these guys again for jumping ability. So this is showing their, these blue bars are showing their mean jumping ability from the generation that I bred. And this is a line that I did with that was very, very strong in breeding that produced that horse that I just showed there. So as you can see, over time in the generations, the mean jumping ability did increase. Great, I accomplished what I wanted to. But if I look at kind of a quick measure of the genetic diversity of my herd, and that is the range of output. So if you imagine if I plotted all the foals that came out of generation 1, there'd be a minimum horse and there'd be a maximum horse somewhere. So the range is the difference between those two. And that's just kind of a quick measure of diversity, genetic diversity, I guess, between the parents. Just if you have a big range, that means the parents are more diverse genetically. As you can see, the first generation, I had a good 20-point range, so quite a lot of diversity into the second generation. But then when I really started inbreeding back to the third generation, it tanked. So that indicates that I have severely reduced the genetic diversity of my herd through inbreeding, which, like I said, the point of inbreeding is to increase homozygosity and decrease diversity. So I was able to do it very fast. That can be a good thing. That can be a bad thing. If it's good alleles that happen to all reduce their diversity, great. But more than likely, you know, dealing with 600 genes, you could get a lot of bad genes, like just increasing only those specific alleles in your herd. So you got to be careful with it. And this was an example here of, I did some weaker inbreeding. So these horses weren't as badly inbred as those ones I showed you, but did still get, you know, increase in their means, and over time, I also did still see a decrease in diversity. It's just not quite as sharp as the stronger inbreeding was. And for comparison, I put those horses from the first test I did way back that I talked to you guys about, where I didn't specifically try to do inbreeding. I think I did accidentally inbreed some horses in it a little bit just because I wasn't paying any attention to anything other than their top stat. But you can see in them, yeah, the mean increased as well. But the range, so the amount of diversity in the herd pretty much stayed the same, slightly increased a little actually. So that's kind of the effect of what inbreeding is going to do. And like I said, you know, the goal of selective breeding is to reduce genetic diversity to only the alleles you want. And inbreeding basically will just get you there faster in theory, depending on how much you manage it. You just got to be careful with it, because while you might increase your blue alleles for one trait, your red alleles might increase for another trait. So it's a double-edged sword. And I know a lot of you are going to ask me, you know, well, what about diseases? Doesn't inbreeding produce diseases? So the answer is it could potentially. So the danger of inbreeding is just if you have a recessive allele that is bad, it produces a disease or has some negative effect on some trait you want, and you have a horse who carries it and you have no idea he carries it, you inbreed to them and suddenly you get homozygous foals and they express the disease or the bad trait. That's what you got to watch out for. The best example I can think of that is HYPP in real life. A quarter horse named Impressive was the first horse to have this mutation. It was a mutation, I think it was in myostatin or a similar gene. It ends up producing horses with a lot of muscling, which in the quarter horse world, these people wanted this for halter horses, these big beefy horses. The problem is while this mutation produces a big muscled phenotype, it's also kind of defective. There's a certain thing about the muscles that doesn't work correctly, and homozygous horses can actually experience episodes of paralysis because their muscles aren't working correctly. So it's not a great thing to have. We don't have HYPP in the game. We didn't include it just because I think we thought about it. It's just we thought about how it would be implemented in the game, and we didn't think it would be like significant enough to really include. But we do have other diseases. And you guys know about HERDA and SID because there are 2 testable diseases in the game, but we haven't actually told you there's actually 4 non-testable, quote unquote, inbreeding diseases in the game. I will eventually make a wiki on this to show you guys more details about it. But these are super, super rare diseases that basically the only chance you're ever going to have of getting these in the game, unless you're super incredibly unlucky, is just through inbreeding. They're extremely rare, but just know that they can happen. I'll tell you a little bit about them. So equine hypohidrosis anhidrosis is basically just the horse sweat correctly. So this, if it happens, you get a horse with this in the game, it just reduces the number of sessions your horse can do for like training and exercise. Equine metabolic syndrome, if your horse were happen to get this, they just easily become obese and gain a little bit of weight, even just on basic feeds. So you have to manage them differently. Equine asthma or heaves, these horses need a medication, which the game just automatically charges you for it on a regular basis, just so that they can breathe correctly and exercise and everything. Keratoma is a tumor that forms in the hoof walls. And if a horse were to pop up with this in the game, they need a random surgery at one point in the game. So it's just a pricey vet bill at one point in the game is what would happen. But like I said, these are super rare. They are recessive diseases. So even if a foundation horse, you happen to get unlucky and one carries it, the chances are you're probably never going to get a foal with it unless you happen to inbreed back to that one foundation horse. So I'm not sure that these are ever going to pop up into the game, but they do exist for fun, I guess, from a weird development standpoint. But fertility, a lot of you probably also know that fertility is also affected by inbreeding. And so we also did simulate that fertility is very likely to decrease if you heavily inbreed. So those horses that I bred probably have some pretty poor fertility because we've got 3 genes, which are, if homozygous, tank your fertility pretty good. But yeah, so that's it for inbreeding. I am going to jump real quick to one last thing, and that is talking about body types in Legacy. So I said a little bit earlier that the imports are partly refined, and what I mean by that is the body types that you get. So we've got 9 body types in the game, even though we have 45 breeds. Body types are genetic. So in order to have these imports in specific breeds only be in one specific body type, we did have to genetically limit some of the genes in order to get to keep your purebred horses in their specific body type. This does have an effect on performance ability to some degree. While most stats in horses are going to be around 50, you will see situations like this light horse here does not have a lot of strength because it's a light horse. So this is what I meant when I said that the game's horses start somewhat refined, is just because we have limited it to where certain alleles do not appear ever in certain breeds in the game. So a little bit more about that is it's just 62 of the genes, so it's about 10% of the genes in the game. These 62 genes controls 10 conformation traits that do have body type restrictions. And I'm going to jump back to Google Sheets real quick to show you kind of what that does to your horses. And let's jump here real quick. So I made a spreadsheet showing 8 of the 10 traits that are limited to body type. The other 2 are crest and feathering, which don't actually affect any performance stats. Those are mostly just cosmetic. So I haven't showed them here. But what this will basically do is if I change my body type, it will give us a kind of middle range value for these stats that would appear within that body type. And then over here, the performance stats will change kind of to an average based on whatever body type I pick. So you're going to see some changes here. You will, like, certain breeds, body types can never achieve certain head profiles, certain neck lengths, back lengths, top lines, things like that, because we have limited these. Obviously, a draft, they should be heavily muscled, so they're never going to be lightly muscled in the game. So let's take a look at what this does here. So if I have a draft right now, you notice strength is high, jumping is very low. Let's go to a stock horse. And you see things change.
Warm blood too, Lydia? Sorry to interrupt.
Sure can. Yeah. Warm blood here. So things change. And then over here, this affects their performance stats. So these are the only things that changed in between when I selected the breeds. Selected the body types. All other stats in the game are equally likely to be certain alleles for all body types. So they don't affect the performance stats. But as you can see, these 8 things here have a pretty significant effect. Whereas this warm blood here has really good jumping, balance, and agility compared to the draft, but also has quite low strength. If we switch to, let's say, go switch to a pony, they have poor strength, obviously, because, they're pretty little. They also can't jump as high because they're pretty little, but they have, good agility, spry little things, good stamina as well because they're a little more lightly muscled, tend to be. Minis, very similar story. Little legs, very sharp turns. They're quite agile. Now, not the best jumpers just because they do have those really short legs and, they're not super strong because they just don't have a lot of body mass. But let's take a look at some others. Stock types are very likely to be, fast and agile, like modern day quarter horses. Saddle, typically very fast horses. Baroque, they are typically more dressage horses, so balance and agility are high. Cobs, honestly, in real life don't really specialize in too much of anything, so they're kind of average in a lot of things and not the best jumpers and not really the best strength just because they're short. But so you can see this is not how every single draft horse, every single cob, whatever is going to be, but there are tendencies in the game because of the fact that we have limited some of these alleles. They will produce horses that tend to be excelling at certain things based on their body type. This is not, you can potentially, breed an underdog, like say a light horse that will out jump a warm blood, depending on the genetics of the actual horse and things. It can happen, but there are some things like if you want to breed a horse for pulling and strength, you're going to want a draft horse for that because they are just genetically this muscle mass and height. These are the big controllers of a lot of things, stamina, strength, speed, and jumping in particular. And the only breeds that you're going to get a lot of muscle mass and a lot of height are drafts. So there are limitations to this. Keep that in mind if you're wanting to breed for a specific discipline. Yeah, let's jump back into this one last time. Almost done, guys. Hopefully I haven't bored you to death. So yeah, things to keep in mind when I tell you this is not all body types can reach 100 on certain stats. An example of that is I don't think the drafts can ever reach 100 on speed. Just based on, physical constraints. They are huge and bulky. They're just not going to be fast. And like I said, some body types will tend to be better at certain disciplines, but that doesn't mean that somebody could come in with an oddball breed and outperform you. And yes, I mentioned this earlier. We didn't restrict colors by breed. The reason why we didn't do this is because, one, it's a game. So it's more fun to just, colors are cool to look at. You can breed for whatever you want. And honestly, in real life, the only reason colors are restricted in breeds the way they are is either because, one, somebody decided in the breed registry that they just don't want certain colors, so they bred them out. Or two, just the foundation horses for that breed just didn't happen to have the color. This is a game. You decide what your foundation horses are. So you get to pick if you want colors or not. But if you are the type of person who wants to, breed for real life standards, that's why we made the conformation shows. They do score you based on real life standards, and color will affect you there. So if that's your thing, we do have something special for you. So it's worth it if you want to breed it out, I guess. That's all I have for the genetics and breeding part of the stream. After this, Whitney is going to take over and tell you all about the exciting big update that's coming. But before we transition, I'm happy to take any questions. I hope I didn't lose too many people with that. That was kind of, a lot of those topics are kind of college undergrad level. I hope I kept them at a pretty basic level of understanding, but yeah, I'm happy to take any questions before we move on.
Don't see any yet. Terrace to say that this was awesome. So
well, thanks. Thanks, Terrace.
Give it a second, guys. And what we're going to do while we wait to see if there's any questions is we're going to actually have to stop the stream so that we can switch from Lydia streaming from her computer to me streaming from mine. But we'll immediately come right back. So that'll be after the questions. So Namira is wondering about the breeds. When breeds meet their max abilities, what happens then?
So if you meet the max ability in one horse, just the chances of you like kind of always keeping that max ability in is just very difficult just because, there's things like hybrid vigor, and there's also a lot of times there's a random chance, a random effect in horses. So, I mean, once you meet your max, great job. Honestly, it's going to be really hard to meet the max just because this game is super complicated. And if you think about it in real life, having a horse who's like the absolute best at something, never going to be a horse that ever beats it, is incredibly hard.
Think of Secretariat.
Yeah.
One of a kind.
So it's going to be really hard to get there. And if you get there, fantastic job. Breeding it continually is, yeah. Sorry, go ahead. Whitney.
So maintaining that will be hard, but once if you do hit a point where you feel like you've hit the max of your breed and you're doing it consistently, start another breed, start over from scratch. That's what I would do personally. So, yeah. Anyway,
it's going to be hard to do that. I hope somebody does do it and like makes me put my foot in my mouth, but it's going to be hard.
I know it probably won't be me because I mean, that's kind of why we made the game the way that we did, is because we wanted something that was super challenging. And I know my first generation of horses from not my foundations, my first generation out of my foundations, barely made any improvement. But that's the thing I love about the game, is you have to do a little bit of trial and error and say, does the stallion work with this mare? Because one thing that Lydia kind of touched on is the hybrid vigor as well. There are some genes in the game where heterozygosity, how do I say that?
Heterozygosity, yeah, you're right.
Okay, I got it right. Is better for different outcomes. So you might have a mare and a stallion that both do really well, but when you cross them, 50% of their foals are, I'm not sure what the math is, are going to be worse because they would be homozygous instead of heterozygous. So, yeah. Anyways, any other questions before we switch?
All right. Well, thanks, guys. Thanks for listening. I'll go ahead and we're going to stop the stream briefly and switch over to Whitney. So we will be right back.